Hamilton, the musical, is a show about the founders of the United States who were mostly white men and to a much lesser extent white women, and it's played by people who are definitely not matched to the race of the historical figures. Like, that is the most conspicuous part of the show. The one thing you can't miss about Hamilton is that the cast is predominantly composed of actors of color playing historical figures who are undeniably white. Chris Jackson, Leslie Odom Jr., Daveed Diggs are all black men, and they play Washington, Burr, and Lafayette, who are all white men. Lin-Manuel Miranda himself plays the title role of Alexander Hamilton, and according to Wikipedia, he is predominantly of Puerto Rican descent and also has distant Mexican, English, and African American ancestry. Once it became clear that the show was going into syndication, Miranda quipped, quote, "That'll be the note that goes with the school productions. If this show ends up looking like the actual founding fathers, you messed up." End quote. As Miranda went on to say famously, this is a story about America then, told by America now, and we want to eliminate any distance. Our story should look the way our country looks. There are people who love this approach. There are people who really do not. And there are strangely a number of people who almost don't seem to notice. We'll do a deep dive into all these points of view and explore the nature of history, the nature of art, and figure out what the race options are in Broadway.com's open casting drop-down menu in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Okay, thank you so much for listening. I am asking for your help in spreading the word about this podcast. If you're listening to this, you are smart, and I'm guessing probably good looking, but it's definitely a niche to be talking about the deep dives and the backstories between Broadway musicals, behind Broadway musicals. That appeals to you, so thank you so much. If you could repost an episode that you like, tell a friend, that will help more than you know. If you get a chance, I would also like you to listen to the back catalog. This is episode 44, so we have 43 episodes going all the way back to episode 1 that cover 5 of the great mega musicals and a couple of really fun interviews thrown in there. It will help the show and help our download count. If you're enjoying this and you want to binge some other productions, then please go back and give this a run from the start. And finally, I will just say that I'm sick. My daughter graduated from high school last night, which was awesome, but I was outside in the cold, screaming way more than I probably should have been. That has resulted in a sore throat. I've taken a bunch of emergency, and the coffee that I'm drinking this morning, I will do a lot for the listeners of this show, but I'm not giving up my coffee for anyone. So anyway, that's probably not what the doctor would like me to be doing right now, but nonetheless, just my apologies for the way my voice sounds. Hopefully it's a little richer and deeper than it normally is. Okay, here is the agenda. We are eventually going to get to all the topics about the multiracial casting question involved in Hamilton. Today, we're going to get to some backstory, how it came to be about, and the haters, the people who think it's a terrible decision or who do not like the decision. And then in coming episodes, we'll talk about the lovers, the people who really like it, those who are indifferent. We'll talk about the context in which the decision was made, a little bit about history, a little bit about art, a little bit about Broadway, and then I'll give you my own take on what I think about the multiracial casting decision. I'll probably give away a little bit of that today, but we'll do a deeper dive into how, at least one way that I think you can put together all the different issues that come up in a way to help us understand the multiracial casting, whether or not that worked, didn't work, good idea, bad idea, net step forward, net step back. We will get to a conclusion on that. But like I said, today, we are just going to focus on the backstory of how this decision came about. And we'll focus on those who do not like the show. And for almost all of these authors, its reasons having to do with its treatment of race. Now, there is a question about the historical accuracy of Hamilton's ownership of slaves and the slavery question. We tackled that in the last episode. If you're interested in the full treatment on that question, then go back one episode, listen to episode 43. I'll cover the key points about that in just a bit. But if Whether or not Hamilton himself personally owned slaves is the center of the question that we've already kind of tackled. Today, we'll talk about now does using actors and performers who are people of color in roles that were historically white people, does that help or hurt? And is that a separate question from the slavery issue? That's what we're going to tackle today. All right. So, our first topic to dive right in here is the question of the backstory. Here, I'm going to be taking almost everything from Brian Eugenio Herrera, who is writing in a journal called Theater, just Theater, in 2017. So, it was pretty early take right after Hamilton came out in 2015. And let's just kind of review the history of what happened with the show and the history of the multiracial casting. And this is just to kind of give you more of a factual background than trying to figure out if it's good or bad. Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, has his hit In the Heights. That's under his belt. And that happened in the 2000s, 2010s about. But now he's opened Hamilton. And by August of 2015, it's a hit. In March, a New York City CBS affiliate took up a controversy about the union being opposed to the use of non-white performers. So that is a TV station in New York City is doing a story about Hamilton and says that the actors union is angry that it was limited to non-white performers during the tryout in the casting call. And that story kind of went viral. The conservatives were saying about what you think they would say about white people being left out. And the more liberal places were covering the story as how was Manuel Miranda addressing what they called the backlash against the show. The Hamilton producers came out with a statement that said they would amend the online casting notice, but were still committed to, quote, multiracial diversity. So they were not backing off the way they had cast the show, but said they would amend the online notice. And then within 10 days of that TV story coming out, the actual president of Actors Equity, that is the actors union in question, whose name was Kate Shindle, gave an interview to Variety and said some diplomatic politic things. You know, the job of the president of Actors Equity is, of course, to promote actors and get their rights protected. But also, what are you going to do when you've got the hottest show that's got a whole bunch of actors of color in it? Hard to come out firmly one way or the other. So Kate Shindle says something, gives an interview to Variety. But by then, the whole issue is what Herrera had called a, quote, forgotten blip. So there was a kerfuffle briefly about the initial casting call. That's going down. But then by the year 2016, Hamilton had won everything. It swept the Grammys. It was setting all kinds of records. They came up with something that a profit sharing deal for the original cast. That's kind of a big deal. Normally when actors perform on Broadway, they get paid a flat rate kind of no matter what happens with the show. But when it was clear that Hamilton was going to become a multi-billion-dollar operation, getting like 1% of that is a pile of money. And the production company and Lin-Manuel Miranda himself came up with this idea. They pushed forward. We are going to share the profits with our original cast. Now, the percentages were small, but the money amounts were big. And that was, a really progressive thing for a Broadway show to do. But it was also at this time that the critical left started to critique the show. That is, the people we have on this podcast before talked about what a critical theorist is, a critical academic theorist is. Mostly if you work as a university professor or you think a lot about what do shows mean, how should shows be interpreted, you are a professional, either theater critic or academic, and those interpretations get published in high-end academic journals. And right after that profit sharing deal, as Hamilton was becoming a big deal, but kind of only after Hamilton was becoming a big deal, the critique started to show up. Okay, so I'm just going to backtrack a little bit just to make sure I've got all these timelines right. But in January and February of 2015, in a venue called the Public Theater, which is an off-Broadway location, the show kind of got its very first start. In January and February, they, of course, had some preview shows, but by February of 2015, the show's going. There is then an open casting call that goes out for the anticipated Broadway run. That Broadway run, of course, is eventually going to open in 2015, but casting call comes out in March of 2015. And then that Broadway show will start its own previews in July and officially open in 2015. So there's a really quick turnaround between the show being off Broadway at the Public Theater in January and February, the casting call in March, and then the official open on Broadway in August 2015. And of course, it immediately takes off. Here is how Herrera describes that casting call. Quote, in the March 2015 casting notice, Miranda or Miranda's team deftly remixes the rigidly codified language of the contemporary casting apparatus to craft a document that reads by turns as a passionate cri de coeur, as a trickster's or hacker's irreverent toast, and as an activist's call to arms. You know, cri de coeur roughly translates as protest. I'm only translating that for you because I had no idea what that phrase meant. It comes from the French. Now you and I both know what that word means. Anyway, Herrera very much reads the brief casting call as a very subversive document. Now, according to Herrera, normally this is what a casting call sounds like. And Herrera takes the example from a show called Hands on a Hardbody. Quote, Norma Valverde, female, 35 to 45, all ethnicities, a stout Latina woman, kind and hopeful, quiet until moved by the spirit, infectious laugh, low mezzo, end quote. So that's the actual casting call. It's really short, and that's what they sound like. Hamilton, by contrast, reads like this. Quote, Eliza Hamilton, non-white, 20s to 30s, soprano, fiercely loyal, self-possessed, proud, evolves from lovesick, wealthy young woman to the sole keeper of her late husband's legacy. Alicia Keys meets Elphaba. Okay, that's got a little more style to it. Herrera's point of view is this, that the whole show is kind of a remix of pop art into the Broadway canon with a healthy dose of non-white culture and style, most prominently the rap music. And so the point at what Miranda's trying to do is take hip hop culture, non-white culture, and move that into Broadway, make that part of the Broadway experience. And in Herrera's viewpoint, the casting call starts to do that. You can see that in the casting hall. And Manuel Miranda knew exactly what he was doing. Quote, Miranda's forthrightness about his casting strategy as simultaneously a personal, ethical, and creative choice immediately troubled established assumptions regarding how actors of color might be assigned roles in commercial entertainments, end quote. Let's just recall that Herrera points out, and I don't think there's a huge debate about this, although we'll get to a little bit of the disagreement in a point, but in a little bit, but Miranda very consciously knew what he was doing. As we mentioned that quote in the beginning, he was saying, if you do an all-white cast, you're messing it up. I am putting non-white in the casting call. I am being straightforward. You can't miss. That's what I'm doing. Now, interestingly, the phrase non-white did not appear on one of the key casting publications, which was called Backstage, an enduring trade journal. If you yourself are not a Broadway performer, Backstage is where the casting calls come out. It's been around for a while. But on that publication, you have to use a drop-down list to select the race of the character. And there isn't a non-white option. You have to pick a race. There's also not an all of the above, and there's also not a none of the above. So, you know what the production team did? They checked every race except for one. I'll bet you can guess which one that was. Now, when Miranda's doing this, it's not the first time it's been done in Broadway history, and Herrera notes that there are some historical precedents. Here's the quote. Quote, in the 20s and 30s, original works, e.g. Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones in 1920, and adaptations, as with Orson Welles' so-called Voodoo Macbeth in 1936, began to utilize what later came to be called conceptual casting, where non-white performers were used to give a new perspective or interpretation on a known story. End quote. So it had been around for a while that you could use non-white performers in traditionally white roles. That wasn't something that Miranda invented, but it was something that he was more over the top about than other things that had happened in history. And there's an author named Galella, who we'll talk about in a second, notes that William Cooper Nell was a black abolitionist who staged in 1858 an exhibition of the Boston Massacre that used all black performers. So that was another historical precedent. And then just kind of follow the arc. In the 1950s, there was a call for more integrated casting. Of course, that became louder in the 1960s. In the 80s and 90s, there was a new colorblind or multiracial casting. But all of that was fairly minor on the Broadway scene, or it was present but not prominent. But once Hamilton made it such a conspicuous element of its show, and then Hamilton took off and took the world by storm within a year of its opening, then that became something completely different. So in Herrera's view, what all the things prior to Hamilton had done was to maintain the assumption that white was normal, and it could be supplemented usefully by people of color. So you could occasionally add people of color, or you could add, a black friend, or you could include some characters that were people of color, but the norm should still be that the cast is mostly white. And Hamilton completely flipped that script. And it was to say normal is not white. Normal is these people of color who can perform every role, including historical figures who were white. And that is a pretty good point. Broadway and American society, and probably most people, and certainly me included, tend not to see it as racialized if you go into a show and see that there's an all-white cast. Like if you just were like, hey, I'm going to go see South Pacific, and you go and watch that, and everybody in it's white, you don't come out and think, wow, boy, race was sure a factor in that film. Everybody was white. But when it's a non-white cast by design, that gets your attention, and it is called a racist. And I'm sure that probably this thought has occurred to every person of color other than Clarence Thomas in the United States, but it is worth remembering, and it's worth restating that white is seen as normal and race is seen as not an issue, even though race is still present. It's just the dominant race. And when a person of a marginalized racial group gains prominence, then the race somehow becomes salient. I think Miranda was trying to intentionally force that question. Okay, so in summary, Broadway tends to be a very white-dominated area of culture. 70% of the audience is white by almost all accounts. Most of them are tourists. There have been minor nods over time to people of color. There was a mini non-story at the very onset of the Hamilton show about its multiracial casting, but then Hamilton blew the whole thing wide open. The multiracial casting became prominent and way more successful than it had ever been in the past. The most normal thing, the most normalized, successful mainstream thing going on in Broadway had people of color playing traditionally white roles, or people who were actually, in fact, historically white people. Okay, so that's just kind of the background and the context, what's going on with a multiracial casting. It's very much intentional. Let's get on to today's topic. These are the haters, the people who do not like the multiracial casting in the production of Hamilton. Now, I'm going to start just by noticing that most people love the show, including people of color. You don't win all those awards and set all those records and get that much interest and energy about going to the show. Like when we tried to go, I think it was like a 7-month wait list to get into a lottery, so you might get some tickets. I mean, just an unprecedented level of interest. Okay, so, and a whole bunch of that audience was people of color. So if audience members were troubled by the portrayals of people of color in that show, they certainly loved the songs of the story. I mean, at least at the elementary school in my, largely Latinx, Latino part of Orange County, all the kids were singing and hip-hopping the Hamilton songs when it first came out. So most people love the show. What I'm about to present are people who did not. I think it's fair to say that they're in the minority. But what they tend to think, what most of these people all tend to think, is that it is a net step backward on the question of race. That, Miranda clearly tried to do something progressive in race and racial representations. These are all people who think that he failed, and failed in a way that was a net step backward. So let's review the people who think that. We're going to go through them one at a time just to give their ideas some depth, and then we'll see if we can come to some conclusions about them, see how that connects back from the show. So our first author is Donatella Gallela, or maybe Gaia, who is a professor of theater at UC Riverside, who's writing in a journal called Theater Survey, which is published by the American Society for Theater Research. So this is a important professor writing in an important journal. What Gallela really does not like, it's the location of this show and the multiracial casting to economics and neoliberalism. Now, we have talked about neoliberalism quite a bit. We've even talked about it in the context of Hamilton. So the critique of Hamilton being neoliberal is not new, but I'm going to let Gallela talk about that in their own words. Quote, "Neoliberalism works with nationalism by linking market values to freedom. David Harvey defines neoliberalism as an economic program of changes pursued since the 1970s to promote privatization, financialization, lower taxes, a smaller safety net, and less regulation. End quote. And in short, the idea of neoliberalism is that laissez-faire capitalism, that is, the less you can regulate the capital free markets, the more freedom there is. Quote, the American dream entails the belief that Americans have a chance at the good life by pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. End quote. And then people who don't like neoliberalism say that the problem is that structural problems and structural racism is downplayed. Yes, it is possible for someone to overcome all the odds and succeed. One of those people, by the way, is Lin-Manuel Miranda. But for every quarterback who becomes Tom Brady, there are thousands of people, me included, that were once high school quarterbacks that didn't make it there. As long as intense competition and capital markets are set out where people compete against each other, there's going to be more losers than winners. And if you set up a system where you're saying like anyone can overcome all of their problems and ignore the fact that people of color and women, just to pick two examples, have a much harder time than everybody else, you're really kind of missing the point, or maybe you're making things worse. Galilla's final comment on this is, quote, under neoliberalism, the goal is not equality, but getting ahead, end quote. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of left-wing critics of capitalism, and they've got a point. We've talked about that before. Unregulated capitalism is bad, and if you ignore all the worker abuses of the Industrial Revolution, maybe you can come to a contrary conclusion, but I think the overwhelming evidence from history is that unregulated capitalism definitely has downsides. Now, Alexander Hamilton is the original neoliberal. He definitely thought that what we needed was capitalism, was founded a bank that is still in existence. It was one of the first bankers, founded the U.S. Treasury. We've talked about all this in previous episodes, but he was definitely pro-capitalism, and in particular was also anti-agrarian, which is part of the reason that he always opposed slavery. So if you don't like neoliberalism, fair bet you're not going to like Alexander Hamilton, and hence you probably won't like a show about Alexander Hamilton. And then Galella dwells at length on the curious case of Barack Obama. He was, of course, the first black president, which is a huge step forward. In fact, his inauguration was called a good American moment, even by conservative news outlets at the time. But he was also steeped in this neoliberal individual effort to move into power rather than smash it mold. He was definitely a liberal reformer and not a revolutionary. Many think he was very much a neoliberal, but he very much embraced the show for sure. Like famously, Lin-Manuel Miranda performed at the White House in 2009. He was supposed to do A Number from In the Heights, but he actually did the opening of Hamilton. Now, that was 2009, so Hamilton wasn't even really a show yet. It was just something he was working on. The show, of course, didn't open until 2015, so it was meaningful that the very first audience for the Hamilton show was Barack Obama, who many think was the ultimate example of a black reformer who is willing to work in white power structures rather than try to tear them down. And as time went on, Lin-Manuel Miranda got even tighter with the Obamas. He performed a whole bunch of times at the White House. His parents, in fact, Miranda's parents were New York City Democrats. They, I believe, were the first generation. They immigrated. They became part of the New York City Democratic political apparatus. And for Galella, that means, quote, the Mirandas are embedded in multi-ethnic, bipartisan establishment centrism, and quote. So Obama is the ultimate bipartisan centrist. The Mirandas are part of that. And Lin-Manuel comes from that background and was tight with the Obamas. And that kind of proves that he was a reformer, not a revolutionary. So what's wrong with that? Well, Galella has a bunch of things that get listed from the outset. Galella cites Monteiro, who we will soon meet, who says that this erases people of culture from that time period, the 1700s and early 1800s. Galella cites Alex Nichols, who calls it blackwash, covering up something by retroactively injecting diversity into it, that you it was racist at the time, but you have black people perform it. You're now blackwashing that element of history to make it seem like it's better than it really was. Galella cites Jason Allen, who's, I believe, a museum curator, who says that Hamilton is, quote, a product of a white American cultural narrative disguised as a unifying colorblind narrative that reaffirms a supposedly shared origin myth, end quote. And so Galella's point in the end goes like this. I will quote one more time. The casting of people of color to embody typically white characters thus showcases the nation as equal, diverse, and inclusive, but only under the terms of emphasizing white history makers and softening the salience of race and racism, end quote. You know, Galella thinks the show emphasizes the self-made man narrative, which hides the structural problems that are faced by most people, and thinks the show still focuses on the exploits of the great white founders of the nation. Galella is also quite disturbed that the show gives nods to slavery, but it doesn't really take it on, and maybe it fudges Hamilton's positions. Critics of the United States will say that inequality is baked into the forming of the U.S., that, you know, slavery was part of it. The United States wouldn't really embrace black people as soldiers or equals, that phrase, everyone is created with inalienable rights, but then we're not giving the vote to women and we're not giving it to black people. You're 3/5 of a person. Anyway, the critics of the United States will show that inequality is baked into the forming of the United States. So we should not be surprised that here we are sitting in 2026 and the United States Supreme Court just revoked the Civil Rights Act, and every state in the Confederacy immediately wrote new district lines to eliminate any black majority district, any place where the black candidate would enjoy a demographic advantage. Okay. And what the critics would say is, does that surprise you? I mean, that has always been the case. And the show totally obscures that in the view of Galella. Galella really does not like the way the show portrays Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings had a sexual relationship with Thomas Jefferson. In Galella's view, it was just a pure instance of rape, but the show calls her his mistress. And for Galella, that's a deal breaker. That is taking an exploited person and washing over what had happened to her. Galella points out the show never really addresses the first people, the Native Americans, calls that an act of erasure, that focusing on a nation of immigrants does pretty short shrift to the people who were already here. If you were a Native person, this nation of immigrants did show up, but you're celebrating what they did. And if you're a Native person, what they did was basically commit genocide against you and take over all your land. Galella thinks the show should address that somehow. The show does include Lawrence as an abolitionist. That's John Lawrence. We talked about him in the past episode. He was definitely in favor of some very progressive things on the question of race, was also a close enough friend of Alexander Hamilton that some people thought they were homosexual lovers. The show does include him, makes him an abolitionist. It also includes Lafayette and focuses on his role as an immigrant. And they link them both to Hamilton to make Hamilton seem, maybe by proxy, he was a little more progressive than he really was, a little more pro-immigrant, a little more pro-abolitionist than the actual record is. Now, we don't have to get into the whole thing, but the actual history is a little more complex than that. Hamilton's actual policies were more elitist. The Alien and Sedition Acts were quite troubling. They were very tyrannical. Now, if you're going to say something, there were 4 of them. 3 of them got repealed in Hamilton's lifetime because they were very anti-free press, very anti-immigrant. But they did establish the ability of the United States federal government to use force to enforce its constitution. And some say that's why the North was able to use the Constitution in the Civil War against the South, that helped create it. But history mostly says those were really troubling, regressive policies. They did not survive very long. And so all of that is part of Hamilton's history. But on the other hand, he was also opposed to slavery. He supported Lawrence's idea of having an all-black military regiment or garrison in the Revolutionary War, although that was eventually voted down. He founded and was an active member of the New York Manumission Society, which was pretty much the only real pro-black game in town at the time. If you were opposed to slavery, there wasn't really an abolitionist group you could join, but Hamilton founded the Manumission Society, which did eventually get passed, the legislation passed that said anybody born after the passage of the act would always be free. He also helped write the Haitian Constitution, Haiti is the only slave revolution that has ever been successful and resulted in a new government. The South of the United States really did not think the United States should be backing Haiti, but Hamilton wrote the Constitution. But on the other hand, his legal practice did involve slave trades, and many people think that he probably owned slaves, including Chernow, and all this is in past episodes. But anyway, let's just say there is an awful lot of complex history around Alexander Hamilton, and Galella takes issue with the fact that the show tends to emphasize the positive and progressive parts of Hamilton. It doesn't really discuss the troubling side. Okay, I'm going to not try to get into too many conclusions right now, but I do want to say two things. First of all, it's kind of fair to say that the show does gloss over some of the uncomfortable history. Like there's a quick mention of the Whiskey Rebellion without really going into what that is. If you do know about it, you would not say that the person who cracked down on the rural people who were trading in whiskey to avoid paying taxes, that guy was a big Democrat and a champion of the people. It's there, but it is glossed over. So if you were unhappy that the show glossed over some of the less flattering parts of Hamilton's life, I think that's fair. But I will also say that the critics themselves are not very nuanced. They tend to make it like if Hamilton had anything to do with slavery at any point in his legal practice, that utterly disqualifies him as ever having been an abolitionist. I think they kind of miss that. The critics tend to downplay or just act like every white male at the time was equally complicit in racism and slavery. That is a viewpoint. If that is yours, I'm not here to tell you wrong, but I will say that you should at least think about what was the difference between Alexander Hamilton, who may have owned slaves and certainly was part of the slave trade, but also formed the New York Manumission Society, supported John Lawrence and a black regiment, and helped write the Haitian Constitution. Was that the same guy as Thomas Jefferson, who openly owned hundreds and hundreds of slaves and impregnated a black woman who had no rights in their relationship together? I think not, but I think no matter what, the critics themselves, I think, can be fairly pointed out as not being very nuanced either. Okay. Back to Galella and what Galella has as a problem against the show. Galella sees Miranda as waffling on whether or not the casting was in fact colorblind and just, quote, got the best performers for the songs, end quote. What I think is happening here is Galella has scanned through or found some quotes somewhere by somebody that said, involved in the production, was like, oh, no. We were not doing multiracial casting. We just wanted people who could hip hop the best. And that's the cast we put together. Yeah, I don't think Galella's got that one right. Miranda was pretty open about, yeah, I'm doing multiracial casting. And if at some point there were some equivocal statements said about that, not everybody could be 100% consistent in everything they say all the time. Maybe they should have been more firm on it. But if you look at the historical record or just watch the show, like you can't miss that the show has got multiracial casting and it's very intentional. Okay, so in the end, Galella just feels like you can't mix capitalism and resistance. And the show tries to do that, and so it fails. And so the multiracial casting is just part of the neoliberal project. And as long as you're part of that, you are entrenching racism and oppression, and you're doing more to do that end, more toward that end than you are to advance anything positive. So to me, here's the crux of the question. If you are in favor of incremental change, do you buy into so much of the system that you can't effectively challenge it? That is, if you think the United States and this whole representative democracy thing is not ever going to not be oppressive, then fighting for a Voting Rights Act is probably just buying into a system to try to get yourself a vote that eventually will never really recognize or help you out. Now, for Galella, the answer to that question is an unequivocal yes. And so the show must be a failure, that you're buying into the system, and so you can't challenge the system. And ultimately, the inequality propped up by people like Hamilton props up people like Miranda. There are winners, but for every Lin-Manuel Miranda, there are 100 losers. And in the theater, probably more than that, more than 100 people tried out for the role that Lin-Manuel Miranda undoubtedly already had. And treating those exceptional people as successes and as the rules rather than the exceptions is a big problem. As long as the system can say you can succeed in theater as a person of color, why just look at Lin-Manuel Miranda, that obscures the structural problems. And that is where Galella squarely lands. So for Galella, neoliberalism is bad. The great man narratives are bad. And that is way more important than the fact that actors are people of color. Okay. Our second contender here is Lyra Monteiro, who I promised earlier we would get back to. Lyra is writing in a journal called The Public Historian in 2016. Now, that publication is published by the University of California Press and on behalf of the National Council of Public History. Monteiro works at Rutgers Newark, so that is a highly qualified academic writing in a very important journal. Okay. Here is what Monteiro's objection to the show is, that whereas Galella focused on neoliberalism, for Monteiro, it is the great white man narrative that is troubling. According to Monteiro, the show says, quote, the only people during this period who mattered were wealthy and often slave-owning white men, end quote. Monteiro does give the show some points for historical accuracy and self-consciously thinking about how history could be written and rewritten. The famous line is, of course, who lives, who dies, and who tells your story, with an emphasis on the who tells your story, acknowledging that history is kind of created and recreated in every generation. Monteiro thinks that's good, but, quote, however, on some of the most important issues of this period, race and slavery, the musical falls short. Another quote, it actively, I'm going to focus on the word there, actively erases the presence and role of Black and brown people in revolutionary America. And the final quote is a truly damning omission in the show. Despite the proliferation of Black and brown bodies on stage, not a single enslaved or free person of color exists as a character of the play, end quote. We've already kind of reviewed what there is in the play about slavery, but Monteiro eventually concedes that you can find slavery and references to it if you listen very carefully to the lyrics, but otherwise you could watch the play, the musical, and come away with the impression that it doesn't exist at all. Monteiro then cites historian David Waldstricher, Waldstricher, who addresses what is called the founders chic. I don't think he invented the term, but writes about it quite a bit. Founders chic, where it's common to invoke slavery to condemn the bad guys in your plot without exploring the issues with the heroes in the plot. So according to, I think Monteiro believes what Waldstricher has to say, that if you're writing one of these founders chic narratives, what you do with slavery is when you find a bad guy, you link them to slavery. When you find your hero, which is in this case Alexander Hamilton, then you kind of link him to John Lawrence and maybe Lafayette, so that he's now more strongly associated with the immigrants and the people of color. So the conclusion ultimately for Monteiro is that it doesn't really matter if you're taking ownership of a narrative, like you're trying to rewrite history and claim ownership. If that narrative is a whitewashed story that celebrates white dudes, what is it you now are taking ownership of, and how are you rewriting it? Now, famously, Lin-Manuel Miranda brought a bunch of students of color who were school kids to come and watch the show. And for Monteiro, this is like the ultimate problem with the neoliberal approach. You think, Lin-Manuel Miranda, you're doing a great civic good by bringing in all these school kids to see your show, but what you're really doing is teaching them the wrong history. So for Galella, the main problem is neoliberalism and capitalism. And for Monteiro, it is focusing on the greatness of the founders, that is the real sin of the show. And as long as you do that, your multiracial casting isn't doing anything. And if you bring in a bunch of students of color who really like your show, you're just teaching them the wrong message. Okay. Before we go on to our next author, I just want to say that the core issue, there are two things. The criticism is that the show, did not show things as bad as they really were. It didn't show slavery. It didn't show how bad it was for people of color during the Revolutionary period. But B, it also downplayed the productive role, the heroism of marginalized people at the time. And Monteiro makes a reference to a person named Cato, who was Hercules Mulligan's black slave, who performed heroically in a number of ways. Okay, so there is some tension there. You can't downplay how bad it really was, but you also have to celebrate the heroism of the people for whom it was terrible. I'm not saying that's impossible. It's probably accurate, but that's just a really tough needle to thread. Like, it is very easy for a show to be criticized, both because you didn't show it bad enough and because you showed it too bad, worse than and than it really was. And, there's not really a right way to do that if that's the thing that you're trying to come up with, or at least the way to do that would be awfully difficult and not really clearly articulated by the critics, particularly Monteiro. So the open question is a failure to include a topic, something like slavery, actively erasing them? Well, Monteiro certainly thinks so. I guess I think that's a more open question. You're taking a book that's 800 pages about a guy for whom he himself wrote tens of thousands of pages, and for whom, if you were to look up the history, there are scores of books, scores of articles, and trying to put it all in 2 hours. You're not going to talk about everything. If you don't talk about something, have you actively erased it? Or did you have to make a choice because you can't include everything? Now, that's a big question that almost all the critical theory gets into, not just the people who are critics of Hamilton. I don't know, but that's the question that Monteiro's article raises. Is a failure to include something active erasure? Let's get back to how that question is dealt with. Okay, and we're about halfway through, and we are getting a pretty good flavor, I think, for some of the different objections to the show. We've got a couple more, and one spectacular one we will end with, and then come to some conclusions. All right. Our third author is Kenneth Owen. Kenneth is from the University of Illinois Springfield and published in the Independent Review in 2017. Kenneth is a more traditional historian, so is not so much worried about the racial politics of the show, although certainly has something to say about it, but is definitely unhappy with focusing on the traditional founders narrative. And Owen says that amongst professional historians, this traditional founders narrative is fading. Now it's way more common to focus on unheralded contributors like Cato or structural forcism like racism, and that those are the things that you should focus on. And I will say those are definitely, those are solid points. Those are things that good historians should be focusing on, that we should not, whatever his traditional narrative we accept, we should supplement that with things that are left out. And Owen is pointing out that that's happening. Owen also notes that the show is based on that book by Chernow, and his treatment, he calls that treatment hagiographic. That actually is sort of like a heroic biography. Traditionally, it was for Catholic saints, but it's essentially a hero narrative. It's less of a biography and more of a hero narrative. And that Chernow's book, in the view of Owen, is a hero narrative about Hamilton. Now, he does give Lin-Manuel Miranda some props for what he gets into the show, what Miranda does include. And he finds that the historical fudges are forgivable, mostly necessary for artistic purposes, but he definitely does not like that white hero narrative. Some key points about Hamilton are that Hamilton was a militarist. He was, of course, a soldier, and he believed in military force as a solution to a bunch of problems. It is true, says Owen, that no other founder had as far to come as Hamilton did. He was definitely the poor guy in the room. But it's also true that he had his own version of the U.S. government that included a monarchy. And Owen is no fan of Hamilton. Quote, "The reason Hamilton left a trail of controversy wherever he trod was not simply the fact that he was aggressive personally. It was that his ideas were often unpopular and often undemocratic." End quote. And Owen also thinks that the reason Hamilton never got elected to federal office, he did win some state level positions, and he was appointed by Washington to do a bunch of stuff, but he never won an election to federal office. And Owen thinks that's because he was too divisive. Okay, now I will just pause here and say, now notice that is the opposite of being too mainstream. That right? What is Galella not like about Miranda? It's Miranda's too mainstream, and your Hamilton story is too mainstream. But if you were to ask yourself, what does Owen not like about Hamilton? He's like, well, he was not mainstream enough. He was too divisive. He took too many hard lines. And, there's probably some tension there, that if the critics are both saying it's bad to be mainstream, then you're criticizing Hamilton for being too divisive and too hardline is maybe the opposite of that. And maybe you got to pick one. But at the end, he concludes that it is, quote, "not a fair and accurate reflection of the country's early years," end quote. And just as a little precursor here, he also in coming episodes, we will talk about the way that women are portrayed in the show. And Owen definitely finds the portrayals of the females as being far too traditional. He is critiquing Lin-Manuel Miranda for making Hamilton look better than he was, but notice that he also thinks that the women are portrayed as too traditional. Well, what if the traditional portrayal was accurate? Were the women more empowered than Lin-Manuel Miranda portrays them? Well, if they were not more empowered than he portrays them, then it's a pretty big contradiction to say that you should have portrayed Hamilton in a more accurate historical way, but don't portray the women in the historically accurate and oppressed way that they were. If you're making them, that would make them seem less traditional than they really were. But if they weren't that traditional, if really they were these people who had huge contributions that were overlooked, Owen doesn't really say how. What was it that Lin-Manuel Miranda was obscuring? What was it these women were doing that was great, that was non-traditional, but that Lin-Manuel Miranda is portraying as too traditional? What is that? That's not really something that Owen can point to, or at least nothing that he points to in this article. Now, he does come to a more nuanced conclusion than some of the other authors. He does say that Hamilton, the show, succeeds because it creates an emotional connection with the historical figures. At the end of that show, you are sad when Hamilton dies. And he says that history is about writing and rewriting a narrative. So who lives, who dies, who tells the story. But, quote, history is more than just imaginative playground for creative types, end quote. So he's saying you do get to write and rewrite history, but the type of history that you write and rewrite matters. And he does not like the rewriting of the great man narrative. The key is that Hamilton was important historically, not because of what he represented, not because he was a poor kid who did good, not because he was an immigrant, but because of what he did. And the show could make more of that. So for Owen, the question is, okay, what do you walk away from that show with? And for Owen, it says, well, from that show, you walk away from the founders' chic message, right? That the founders were the great people who made this country work, and they were cool, and we should learn more about them. And if only we had leaders today that were as cool as they were, we would have a better country. What we should focus on instead, says Owen, is the historical importance. Okay, I get that. That is true. But if you were to say, well, what was it that Hamilton did do? As I just talked about, you could point to some bad stuff, but you would also say he founded the Treasury. He rescued the nation from a debt crisis that would have killed it. And then he probably set in motion the things that were necessary for the North to win the Civil War. He also wrote the Federalist Papers. And without that, we probably wouldn't have a constitution. The show mentions those but doesn't really focus on either one. Should that have been the show? It seems to me like Miranda was trying to say, I'm going to focus on Hamilton and make it personal to create this personal connection. Should he have made a show that celebrated him more as the founder of the Treasury, the guy who wrote the Federalist Papers? Would that make Owen happier? Would that avoid Owen's critique? I do think you can say, the reason we're doing a show about Hamilton is he did a bunch of important stuff. A lot of it is not remembered or recognized, and a lot of it isn't in the show. But if you want to create an emotional connection and a good piece of art, you probably need to show something about the personal struggles of Hamilton and his personal transformation. And I think that's there. In the end, Owen thinks that it's an exceptionalist narrative, and his phrase is, quote, a top-down, elite-driven model, end quote. And that, quote, it is a shame that such great entertainment and such great art fail to examine the complexities of the past more fully, end quote. So for Owen, it's the founders' chic narrative that is troubling and the great historical figures narrative. An extension of this comes from Andrew Shockett. This will be more brief, but he's a professor of history and American culture studies at Bowling Green University, writing in the Journal of the Early Republic in the summer of 2017. Shockett, interestingly, it also takes exception with the founders' chic, and he can list 9 different prominent productions that fall into this founders' chic mold that have all happened since the year 2000. And for Shockett, all of them have 3 key elements. First of all, they all presume that there was a deep patriotism for all of the Anglo-Americans involved. There were some of them, but even then it's like, some of them were patriots, but also jerks. And a whole bunch of the white people were actually British loyalists. So he finds that to be mythic, but that is the characteristic of the founders' chic narrative. You have to start with the assumption that all those Anglo-American guys were patriotic. Second, you have to believe they rallied around freedom and liberty, and that the narrative has to kind of bury who gets the freedom and liberty, because obviously many people did not. And third, that the narrative ends, the win happens when we expel the oppressors, get rid of the British, get rid of that other that is oppressing us, and then we win. That is what Shockett says all the founders chic narratives have in common, and Hamilton basically embraces all of these core elements. And so for Shockett, casting, quote, masks the musical's otherwise conventional white-centric storylines and has not so much transformed the revolution rebooted conversation as reified it, end quote. And reification means, kind of entrench it. You make it more solid, you make it harder to get rid of. That is the crux of the critical objection to it. There are two other people I'm going to mention just because they're kind of fun. Edward Peter Stringham is an economics professor at Trinity College of Hartford, writing an independent review. And what is fun about Stringham is he starts by saying, look, I hate musicals, but I do like this show. And then he takes issue with Hamilton as the founder of Wall Street. Quote, Hamilton mania should not be used to advance the narrative that politicians are responsible for inventing our financial system or American capitalism itself, end quote. Well, that's certainly a minority viewpoint. Stringham is aware of that. I don't know, man. The guy who founded the U.S. Treasury and the most prominent person advancing banking, and the dude who got mercantilism to triumph over agriculturalism, he probably had something to do with it. But then he does, as the other critics, oppose the great man theory. He doesn't want to see that in a musical, but for the opposite reason that almost everybody else did. He thinks that markets are collective actions and not the decisions of individual politicians, that great big invisible hand is just guiding what a whole bunch of people do to make the economy work. That's what he thinks is going on. And that's inevitable and not the product of any great man. Now, I will say that is true that Adam Smith talked about the great hand, but as per our previous episode, lots of people read Adam Smith, but nobody else other than Alexander Hamilton rescued the American economy. And, boy, if there's one truth to history, it's that, yes, politicians can really mess up the economy for real. If you haven't seen Annie, if you've seen Annie, you know that much. I mean, we have recessions and depressions. We have had stock market collapses. We have had bubbles burst, and all of that is because this invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about does not work quite as perfectly as you would think. And, everybody read Adam Smith at the time, but as we had talked about in the previous episode, Smith was really just talking about Bank of Scotland, or at least that was his predominant model. And one thing Hamilton did that was different from what Smith did was to look at all the banks to come up with his idea for the U.S. Treasury and kind of rewrote it. So if you think that Adam Smith was completely right about the invisible hand and that economies happen and there's nothing really that governments could do about them and no one is to be credited with the founding of the American economy, yeah, sure, then maybe we don't think about Hamilton as a great man for founding the Treasury. But I do think it's probably counterfactual. It is probably, you have to ignore an awful lot about what Hamilton did and about the consequences of that to decide that that guy in particular played an important role in the American economy. And I will share some thoughts later about the overall great man theory. Okay, anyway, it's fun to note that others think that the musical downplays structural forces like oppression or racism or capitalism, but the structure that Stringham thinks the show downplays is capitalism. But it's good, not bad. Anyway, that is a fun little contrasting viewpoint. Anyway, imagine you're Lin-Manuel Miranda. You've written this show. You put your heart and soul into it. You've made a big deal over multiracial casting. You are getting it from all sides at this point. But nobody has a more over-the-top hate reaction to this show than Ishmael Reed. I am going to crib here from an article from the New Yorker by their Pulitzer Prize winning staff writer, Hua Su. That is H-U-A is the first name. H-S-U is the second name. All right. So I myself have not seen the show that Sue is talking about here. Almost nobody has. It never got picked up, but it is Reed's reaction to Miranda. And so anyway, I mentioned all that just to say what I'm about to give you is not my own personal reaction to the work of Ishmael Reed. It's almost all taken from Sue's reaction to it, but it is worth thinking about. Ishmael Reed moved to New York City in 1962. He founded a bi-weekly publication called the East Village Other, and then since then he's published dozens of books, the most famous of which is titled Mumbo Jumbo, and it was published in 1972. Now, for the rest of who Reed is, I'm not going to improve on the Pulitzer Prize winner's description of Reed, that is Ishmael Reed, so I'm just going to read it. Here we go. Quote, Reed's works are rooted in a meticulous study of slavery, Black performance, and political revolution, but he shapes these materials into sweeping, manic stories that are preposterous and perverse because they try to make sense of a country that, in its founding, normalized the most preposterous and perverse institution imaginable. Even as Reed has become part of the canon himself, he remains prickly, resisting attempts to assimilate his work in any story that flatters American progress. End quote. So that is who Reed is. If you are a critic who believes in revolution and not reform, and you think that there's no point in incrementalism or trying to reform the United States because at its very inception it had injustice written into it, Ishmael Reed is your guy. All right, my voice is starting to fail me. Let's see if we can get through the end of this thing. Reed, not surprisingly, hated the show from the jump and accused Lin-Manuel Miranda of smoothing over slavery and the genocide that happened against Native Americans. But this culminated in 2018 when he did what was essentially an elaborate table read of a 2-act play called, quote, The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. That was the title of the show. And during that show, Miranda is haunted by ghosts, Christmas Carol style, that includes slaves, his in-laws, Native Americans who were written out of his story, and Harriet Tubman, who might have been Harriet Tubman, who might have been another character named Tubman. But Miranda is basically shown as unable to cope with anything that is fact-checking and just keeps deferring to Ron Chernow. And at one point, he simply yells out, but Ron Chernow. There's no real action, just a bunch of shots at what Reed perceives is Miranda's shoddy research. And see his viewpoint, Lin-Manuel Miranda in the show is actually portrayed as a victim. So this is not like Reed saying, man, I am so jealous. Why is it that Miranda gets to be the voice of the people of color? That ought to be me. He's got all the success. He's not doing that. He's more like patting Miranda on the head and saying, oh, you poor kid, you don't understand what you're doing. And you are a victim of shoddy research and an inability to understand where you're coming from. And then there's a moment when Miranda only comes to realize the issue when the ghost of Hamilton himself appears, and he is craven and openly racist. And then in the punchline, Lin-Manuel Miranda's agent shows up to offer him to write the follow-up to Hamilton that is about Christopher Columbus. So Reed is very much of the masking that multicultural casting masks historical inequity, that the incrementalism is bad approach, and that the rags to riches stories are for Reed, quote, distracting us from the crookedness of a system that dooms the rest to misery, end quote. Now, Sue notes that Lin-Manuel Miranda has done a lot of good with his fame and his wealth, but for Reed, all of that is just propping up a fundamentally unfair system. So I think that unlike most of your Broadway success stories, Lin-Manuel Miranda has done a lot to try to go out, go into the community, connect with people, connect with young people. And if you are a critic of incremental reform and you want to be a revolutionary, then you think all those things that Lin-Manuel Miranda is doing that he thinks are good, you think is bad. All right, number one critic of the show is Ishmael Reed. As I mentioned at the beginning, that show of his has not been produced. It has not been picked up anywhere, but I do think it embodies all the criticisms of it. Let's briefly mention the conservative reaction to the show and then wrap this sucker up. Just to think about the way the conservatives have reacted now, Monteiro thinks that conservatives universally loved it. Obama famously joked that it was the only thing that he and Dick Cheney agreed about. And Galilea's article starts at the very start of it, recounts this bizarre incident in Utah. We talked about this in a past episode, but basically there is a Democrat and a Republican who were both members of the Utah legislature, showed dressed up in period costume and jointly wrapped a resolution commending the show. So all of that is the thing that points to conservatives generally like the show. There are definitely people who think that they do. Now, Herrera points out that the Breitbart news service, which is, I think it's fair to call it, fake news with an extremely conservative bent, they certainly didn't like it. They picked up that CBS News story and ran with it in the most negative possible way. The CBS story itself was definitely casting a weird eye at the show, like, oh, maybe something messed this up. CBS now is, of course, shifting sharply to the right now that it is owned by a billionaire. There was also that famous Mike Pence incident where right after Trump got elected the first time on the Trump-Pence ticket, Pence showed up at the show and the actress from the stage talked to him and said, look, man, we're worried you're going to try coming to kill us. The irony was that then the conservatives slammed on the production for a while, a hot minute, like for a 24-hour news cycle. The conservative media was freaked out that they would disrupt Mike Pence. The irony, of course, being that 4 years later, Mike Pence would be hanged in effigy. Like if he would have shown up to that January 6th insurrection, he would have been killed. So, the actors were saying, hey, we're worried these conservative forces that you lead are going to kill us. It turns out they wanted to kill him too. Within 4 years, they had turned on it anyway. But at the time, I guess that was some evidence that the conservatives were opposed to the conservative view, was more opposed to the show than the way Montero thinks it is. If conservatives universally loved it, they sure didn't like the fact that Mike Pence got called out when he attended the performance. Now, Trump himself has been strangely muted on the show, although he sure hasn't invited Lin-Manuel Miranda to perform at the White House like Barack Obama did. I guess, when you're hosting all those wrestling events, you don't really have time for musical theater. But you would think Trump would be all over screaming about the show, but he's not. You would think that the conservative, very far right, which is now, just 8 years ago, you would have said, who's the far right? Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham. They are now way too liberal. They're on the outs, right? You've got to be way more conservative than that to be a part of the Trump universe right now. All right. So you would think that the president that embraced the march on Charlottesville as good people on both sides would freak out about multiracial casting and non-white performers, but it's been way more muted than you think. Now, maybe that is because, as the critics note, the conservative view loves the founder chic. Maybe it's just confusing when people who disagree with people of color are seeing people of color celebrating the founder of capitalism, or maybe the show is just so good that it transcends the left and the right wing position. But for whatever reason, the bulk of the anger against the show has come from the far left. I'm sure there's some conservatives who don't like it that much, but if you were to say who objects to the multiracial casting of Hamilton, it is strangely more left-wing critics than it is the far right. Okay, so what does all of this mean now? As we talked about on the outset, in our next episode, we'll talk about the people who like the show. Today, the emphasis has been on who are the people who don't. Well, generally, the critique of the show has been that it tries but fails to be progressive on the question of race. And it fails because it does not go far enough. It doesn't go far enough to critique the founders' chic narrative. It doesn't go far enough to critique the unfairness that was baked into the U.S. government from the outset. It doesn't go far enough in critiquing the economic system that both the U.S. and the show are active participants in. And foundationally, I think the criticisms are revolution versus reform. Now, we will talk about later why the revolution versus reform thing is maybe not as one-sided as these critics think. But we can at least start thinking a little bit about this. In the next show, like I said, we'll get to the other side, but there's a few comments we can make for now. Here's the first one. On the question of race, I am struck by how much is made of not including people who were enslaved, or more historically accurate, people of color at the time. There were people of color during the revolution, and the show is criticized for not including them. And that's what all the critiques focus on, but they don't ever even really address the upside, which is having people of color playing historically white figures. What does that do? Well, we'll talk about it more in the next episode, but it certainly decenters, it questions, did these people have to be white? What would have happened if these were people of color? So the first thing is, I think it it talks about the people who were not included in the show, and it almost doesn't talk at all. The critics do talk about the people of color who are in the show. At least as I read through all those articles, I didn't see hardly any discussion of that. So that's one thing we can stick a pin in, keep in mind before we get to our next topic next week, which is just that there's a lot of talk about what the show did not include, but almost no discussion of what the show did include. The second thing I will say is that there's not a great sense of balancing. These articles do tend to say things like this are racist people. Or sure, that multiracial casting is great, but that just masks the oppressive way that it is supporting a great man narrative. So it talks about it erases people. It masks oppression. Now, those are good points. Those are definitely things that should be discussed. The show should have to answer for. But the core question is, why is it a net effect that it masks more than it empowers, or it does more to mask or erase people than it does to deconstruct the idea that it had to be white men taking these actions? The show definitely shows that race is arbitrary, that you can take a person who is historically white and you can have them played extremely well by a person of color. If it also masks history or uses a conventional narrative, okay, it might do both things. So why is it more important that the work doesn't mention some people or might be masking some things that were bad than it does to challenge the racial portrayals? Anyway, it's very possible that it does both. And if it does, then the question is, which is more important? And what I'm struck by is not so much that I think the articles that talked about this are wrong when they say that it masks and it erases people, and then they say that's more important and make arguments than when they talk about the upside, the positive things that the show does for race. It's not so much that they are comparing them. It's that they never make the comparison. They just say, well, it does these bad things. And then they never talk about any possible good thing it'd have. But to me, I think that's really the central question. You are saying it has some limits on its treatment of race. If it's trying to do some good things, are the bad things worse on balance than the good things? And there's almost no attempt even really to balance those questions. And finally, the third thing is, if the central question is reform versus revolution, then it is a threshold question. And by threshold, I mean like a threshold is typically a door that's an entry to a house. So the question is, at what point do you come in the house? Well, at the point where you cross the threshold. Okay, so if you are a reformist when we need a revolution, then the central question is, when do you go far enough? That is the big question in all these debates. And I think maybe that's really the central question, or maybe the only question. At what point does your attempt to improve things really just entrench a system that makes it worse? And when does it truly empower the system? Now, I will say, if there's one lesson you can take from the French Revolution, that's a hard question to answer, right? You know, the revolution started with, okay, well, we need to form a legislative branch. Okay, great. It went from there to, okay, well, we can't have a king. We have to actually behead the king, to now we have to behead all the people who originally formed the legislature that didn't support beheading the king enough, because only if you're a true, pure revolutionary and you're willing to go all the way into killing the king the whole time, if you're ever even kind of opposed to that, we have to kill you now. Okay, well, history does not say, yeah, that, hardlining on the revolution worked great for the French Revolution. And that's just one, right? There's a whole bunch of other historical examples. I'm not saying I know the answer and the French Revolution is the definitive thing, but I'm saying the central question is, when have you gone far enough? And for the third time here, I think the critics just don't even talk about that. So if you were to say, okay, I hear what you're saying, right? You put a bunch of people of color as the main actors here, but you didn't talk about slavery. Maybe you erased some of those people, and maybe you're masking history and kind of buying it as great man narrative. Those are all good points. But now if I were to say, okay, so how does that balance against the good thing the show did by including all those people of color? What do you think of the thing about it, including the actors' race? Did that have a good effect at all? And if you were to say, okay, so you think that that's not going far enough, that's too reformist, we need a revolution, how far do you have to go? If you ask those three questions, I don't think you could find a word in any of the authors that I just cited that even address that question. I think that's what's missing. I'm not saying that they're wrong necessarily. I'm only saying that the critique is pointless unless you can say what would have been enough. you can always do more. The question is what you did so insufficient that it just entrenches the system, and when is it that it's done enough that it can effectively challenge and make some progress? Okay, and I think that's what the central issues are, and we are going to get to that next time when we then say, okay, so we now know what the people who don't like the show think, and we know what the people who don't like the show didn't really talk about. Let's get to the question of, okay, so the people who did like the show and think that it does a much progressive on race, what did they think? That's what we will get to on the next episode of Theater History and Mysteries. For now, this is me signing off. I noticed that my voice has gotten considerably more ragged over time, and I know that was a lot of critical theory and a lot of authors, but as I said at the outset, you are listening to this podcast because you are smart. It's not enough for you just to say, hey, there's a race question in that Hamilton show. What's up? You need to get to the deep dive and figure out what all the smartest people are saying about it. Today, we've taken a look at what the smartest people who don't like the show think. Next time, we'll get to what the people who do like the show think, and we'll get closer to answering those 3 great unanswered questions on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.